Hey guys, welcome back to episode 4 of BCM in the AM. Today we're going to be talking about depression and the gospel and how we function and how we deal with and how do we tackle depression in a godly and a respectably biblically manner. So, to everybody gathered, we have Kate White over here again with us.
Hey, it's such an honor to be here.
And Samm Hawes.
Hey, hey, hey!
And Jarrod Justice.
Hey guys, good to be back with you guys.
And I'm Zach. And so, when I ask this question, just the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the word depression, starting off on a very happy note.
Hey, it's okay. Let's get real. I mean, honestly, the first thing I think of is the Great Depression. And I think of these black and white photos of families trying to make it and hardship and I think of suffering and the difficulty of that time. That's honestly one of the first things I think of when I think of depression. I think of the Great Depression of our country.
Yeah.
I think of just the feeling, it's kind of like an out of body experience. Like you're going through the motions, but you don't experience the emotions. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the word depression, it's a sad word. You know, I mean, it's an expression of maybe what kind of sadness and fear are together, like a despair.
Yeah.
I think of even kind of the winter blues, you know, when it gets really cold and rainy. But that's what comes to mind for me.
That's exactly what I think of too. Is that winter time,
Yeah.
it's overcast, it's not actually raining, but it's too cold to do anything outside. It's what am I supposed to do with myself? You know? So
Exactly.
like we had said on the last episode too, when we approach these terms, they are sad terms. They are hard terms to swallow. But is there such thing as good grief or good, not as in terms of the saying good grief, but in terms of is there good grief or sadness that we experience?
It's a good question. I'm going to think about it for a minute. Kate or Sam?
Actually, in my reading in Scripture today, there was a reference to godly grief in 2 Corinthians 7. It talks about how godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. And I think that's in response to grief, to our own sin, and a sadness, and a response to our own actions. And I understand that's not maybe the exact direction you were thinking of, but when my kid, specifically Charlie, little Charlie, because she's such a people pleaser, when she makes a poor choice, she doesn't respond with anger, but she responds with this deep sadness of do you still love me? Am I still good? I can't tell you the number of times am I still good? Oh yeah, your choices don't define your goodness, but I still love you and things of that sort. And so
Yeah.
I thought of how godly grief leads to repentance and worldly grief leads to death. So I do think there can be good grief in, as an example, grief over our sin.
Yeah.
I think of moving into different seasons of life. You're sad to be leaving this season of life, but a new season is starting. And this new season's going to be good.
Yeah.
I think that when it comes to loss, if we talk about it in terms of a breakup or someone passing away, it's good to grieve.
Yeah.
In Scripture where it talks about weeping with those who weep, there's this importance to our, what I was going to say is we can't just ignore what we're feeling. We can't ignore, back to some of what we were talking about in the anxiety episode, where I can't ignore that I'm sad, or I can't ignore that I'm so in despair that this person's not in my life anymore, or that I lost my job, or that this person that I love doesn't love me. And so we have to, I think, give ourselves permission to grieve and to be sad. I grew up in sort of a situation where at times it was almost like this shame as a man, as a young man, to be sad at all. Kind of the old A League of Their Own, if you've seen that movie where Tom Hanks says, there's no crying in baseball. And sort of this, I've got to just grin and grip. I've got to make it through. I can't show any tears. I've got to be tough. I've got to, just rub some dirt in it. And there was a lot for me to have to navigate, especially in my 20s and early 30s, about what does it look like to be appropriately sad and to grieve losses in my life.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I think it's more of a process than it is just something that, we can say, this one thing is good. It's like this series of things that I had to deal with in order to get to a healthier place that I am now is what I would call like a period of good grief.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I would say like at this moment I was grieving in a good way, like I feel like grieving kind of ebbs and flows, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like grieving can ebb and flow to, some days we're gonna very helpfully say, I'm grieving. Am I grieving over this sin? Am I grieving over this loved one? Drives me back to the Father.
Right.
And exactly like what you quoted out of 2 Corinthians, is that like in my unhealthy moments, is it gonna drive me? It says death there, and we will talk about suicide to some extent, but also is it driving me to kill different good things in my life? Like am I killing relationships? Am I putting to death different behaviors or habits or attitudes that are actually beneficial for me because of this? And I think it's important that we are establishing kind of a baseline as we dive off into the deep end, so to speak, as we go. So we're kind of bridging on this aspect of grief and depression and how it kind of translates as we move toward this hot button word that we're all dealing with.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the question that we're all hammering at, is where is that crossover at?
Yeah, it's good. Well, I think just on a personal note, I think for me, I deal with a lot of symptoms of depression, especially through the winter. If you want to call it like the winter blues, or the clinical term would be seasonal affective disorder, where for certain months out of the year, like even last year, I'm thinking, you guys remember February? It like rained for 1,000 days.
Yes.
I mean, it was really tough. And so when it's gloomy outside and I'm not getting enough sun, I'm not maybe exercising as much because it's cold and I'm the fair weather runner, I can be kind of gloomy and down and low. And so sometimes, again, similar to what we talked about with anxiety, some of it's circumstantial, some of it's maybe even seasonal, or something that's happening sort of situationally that I might be experiencing depression. When grief's involved, and I just it's a really, really painful thing, but a couple people that were really important to me passed away back in April and in May, kind of back to back. So I just felt like these tsunami waves hit me, and I was experiencing a lot of grief for losing these people really important to me. But I was also experiencing some depression with COVID happening. And as a counselor, we were doing like video sessions, and I'd just been thrown into that. And so I kind of was in a little bit of this shutdown place. Like I'd gone outside of my ability to have sort of a normal routine. So many people would relate to that. They've maybe lost someone over the last year, or just the way COVID has affected work or school. And so there's a real grieving that's happening, but at the very same time, people are experiencing, because of that, some depressive symptoms. Like I'm not wanting to get out of bed. Like I don't want to go anywhere. These kinds of things. I'm sad. Why am I crying at like a Johnson & Johnson commercial? I don't know. There may not be a sad Johnson & Johnson commercial, but
I'm sure we could find one.
I thought you were motioning like you were going to say something too.
So sorry to disappoint you, Zach. I think he covered it, man.
And to Sam. Oh, that's awesome. I love being able to cover that in more detail, and being able to say, like, I really appreciate, especially as a counselor, that you're willing to say, like, I deal with this too. Right. Not coming from a place of like, here are the answers, right? But saying like, no, I deal with this, and I use these things in my own life, and so these are some things that you can use in your life. And I think that's something we really respect you for. And I think that's something that we were even talking about in the anxiety episode, that, we are, it's better for us to exude the kind of things that we want to see out of the people we're trying to help,
Right.
And
Yeah.
so if we're willing to come up and say, I deal with this, does
Yeah.
that sound like something that you deal with too? That has
Yeah.
paid huge dividends, you know, and just in my 5 months of working at the BCM, I've seen multiple people that I've said,
Yeah.
I've dealt with grief over this, and they've
Yeah.
said, yeah, me too. And
Yeah.
we've been able to create such a deep bond because of that,
Mm-hmm.
and get to a healthier place, both of us, because of that. I think it's been really good.
Yeah.
And so I think in identifying those things in heroes in our life, just like in heroes in the Bible, like how do we, like, are there biblical characters that display depression so that we can, you know, take notes from their life and say, you know, what things drove them back to the Father, and what things did they not do so well that maybe we can take note on to do differently.
Right. Of course, the Psalms, I think, are a great example, as we
Yeah.
mentioned last time. I think of, maybe because I'm a parent, I think of David's response in 2 Samuel when his son is sick. And he's covered with ashes, and he's weeping and mourning for the loss of his son, whom he's losing as a result of his sin with Bathsheba. And I am not wise enough to say that is depression, but that is really vivid, deeply expressed grief
Yeah.
that resonates in me with just the hint of losing my own child. Like, I experience grief at the thought of it. Nonetheless, the actual walking through of that experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, again, appropriate grief. The mourning of a child in the throngs of pain and sickness is so appropriate. It's so reasonable. It's needed. It's a needed grief.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways for me, as I'm thinking about kind of how grief and depression connect, when we become so overwhelmed by our losses. So say I lose a parent, say I go through a messy breakup. I mean, I've had college students, both, you know, guys and girls, sitting in my office, and they're so depressed after this messy breakup, and they're so ashamed that they're still feeling down about it months later. And I'll ask the question, you know, well, how long did you date this person? And they'll say, you know, a year or 2 years or 3 years. And we start to talk about, well, how come, so you dated them for this long, and why do you think that you're just going to be, quote, I'm doing air quotes in my office, why do you think you're going to be over them in a couple weeks?
Right.
And so sometimes grief lingers, kind of like a bad cold or something.
That's a good way to put it.
You know, but sometimes when we lose something like a pet, or, I mean, it's not a laughing matter. I mean, you have these. I remember losing my dogs as a young kid and experiencing loss in that way for the first time, or going through a breakup myself when I was a freshman in college, and just how low that some of that emptiness and loss can feel when you've got a hole in your heart. And so it's of course going to take some time to get back to this place of healing and restoration, when maybe your whole life was built around this person, or built around this job, or built around this thing. And so learning to navigate it and not get stuck in the ditch, so to speak, of depression. But there can be, back to kind of some of the biological things. So it's not all circumstantial. There can be some things chemically, hormonally, that, you know, medical professionals or a med manager, that can help think through what's something that's a bit more organic, that's a bit more biological. But we're holistic. We're not just a body. We're not just, an emotional being. So we've got to think through sort of the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual aspects of what depression is all about. And it depends for every single person what is happening kind of in their unique journey.
Yeah, I totally agree. And harkening back to like some of the stories of the Old Testament, like even just, I mean, if we just want to be honest, the entire book of Lamentations talking about like,
there's a book called Lamentations.
Yeah, exactly.
Book. Yeah.
And so considering that is something that God knew that should take up part of the Bible, like let's be honest here, then he knew that we would experience things like this. We're not taken in by surprise by being depressed sometimes, you know?
Yeah, and I've heard different ones say at times, oh, well, Christians aren't supposed to be sad, or Christians aren't supposed to be afraid. I mean,
Wow.
at different points, that's what I've heard. And I'll ask, okay, well, whoa, let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of these different scriptures that point to, I mean, even Jesus saying, in this world you will have trouble.
Yeah.
But he's like, take heart, I've overcome the world. So it's not that it's bad or wrong to feel sad or feel depressed, quote unquote, but it's what do we do with that? And I do think, you know, we like to read all the happy clappy psalms, you know,
Right.
rejoice, you know, sing praises to our God, you know. But what about a Psalm 88 that ends with, you know, darkness is my closest friend? What do we do with that? What do we do with Job? What do we do with Lamentations?
Yeah.
What do we do with some of the questions that David asks, like, how long, O Lord? Basically, like, do you hear me? Are you here? Are you near?
Right.
Yeah.
Because in his humanness, he's being honest about how he's really doing, and such despair with loss that we see in Scripture, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that all of those, like, extremely, almost visceral emotions
Right.
that we, as believers, sometimes can say, my joy is found in the Lord. Yes, and amen to that. Our joy is found in the Lord. But also our sadness is meant to drive us back to the Lord as well.
Sure.
And so, you know, and like you said, in having an entire book about Lamentations, that should give us a red hot flag that is saying,
Yeah.
look, God cares about you when you are joyful in Him
Right.
and when you don't feel Him there,
Yes.
you know? So, you know, what are some practical ways that we can kind of address this? Because we've addressed it from like a, let's define it, let's talk about things that, you know, are surrounding it. We've talked about ways that we see it in all across the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, like, what are some ways that we can address this in our lives? How do we address depression?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is back to some of what Dan Siegel talks about with the window of tolerance that we talked about in the first episode on anxiety, where when we go outside of our ability to cope in our optimal kind of river of wellness, kind of when things are all good, kind of sunny 70, an anxiety place might be the hyperarousal, kind of a fight or a flight response. So think of like the survival mode then of the freeze response, kind of a shutdown, which is more of the hypoarousal. So if I'm going at it, something like grief hits me, so you know, I lose my job, I something happens where I feel so despairing in the circumstance, it might take me beyond what is a normal ability to cope, because I'm limited, I'm human. And so that freeze response might be more of that shutdown or that depression. I can't get out of bed. You know, I've lost all interest in the things that I normally find pleasure in. I don't want to go out to eat. I don't want to see a movie. I'm just in a shutdown mode. And some of that, to be aware too, some of the suicidal ideation, some of the suicidal thoughts, right, can be in this area where I feel so shut down, where it's like, man, it's just too hard. I just want to hit the easy button.
Yeah.
And so we begin even thinking like, well, can I drop out of school? Can I just go hibernate somewhere? You know, and there's such an importance to, I think, understanding the way the body's responding. Because some people might tend to go into more of the fight or flight, more of the hyperarousal place, but others might go to more of a shutdown, more of a, I'm really despairing, I'm just going to be under the covers, and I want to sleep a lot. I don't want to go out and do anything. It's hard to even take a shower. It's hard to do the dishes. You just feel so shut down.
Yeah.
And so to be aware of it over time, I mean, it can really turn into, you almost can get a bit into a stuck mode in either an anxious place or either in a despairing place.
I think a big practical thing I think of is pick up your phone and call a friend.
Yeah.
I think one of the things you mentioned earlier is mourn with those who mourn. And I also think the flip side, allow others to mourn as you mourn.
Yes.
You know, in parentheses next to that.
Yeah.
Give people permission to come into your sadness and be with you in that. It's just a really practical tool to think about.
Yeah.
It's good.
I'm so guilty of that, of like like, if I'm sad, I'm like, no, you can't be sad too, you know, like, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
But like, sometimes that's what I need, is somebody just to be like, yeah, that sucks, you know, sympathize with me, empathize a little bit. So, you know, when we bridge on this and we're talking about depression, and, you know, how do we know, because we just dabbled a little bit into like the shutting down of it all.
Right.
How do we know when to seek professional help in this? Like we said in the
that's
last episode,
Yeah.
you know, not a fly, no fly zone, you know, set line, but like,
Right.
Yeah.
what are some red flags that we could be picking out?
Yeah, well, I think, again, like, something that is sort of beyond like a basic sadness or despair looks like it's affecting every part of your life.
Yeah.
So again, the clinically significant distress or impairment in, you know, social, vocational, and other areas of functioning where I'm losing all interest in everything that I normally thought was pleasurable. You know, I am in bed days and days and days at a time. I'm having suicidal thoughts. This is where you really start to get to this place of needing help outside of yourself, which is okay. If you're in that place, it's okay to need others. In fact, that's what I think some of the shutdown is telling us, is I wasn't made to do this on my own. I need somebody else. I had gone to for some of my grad school work, I was required to go to an Alcohol Anonymous meeting, and there was an older gentleman there, and he had his overalls on and stood up and just was kind of a sage to the whole group.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying something so profound, and he was encouraging different ones, like, I'm glad you didn't take a drink, I'm glad you're, you know, celebrating your recovery and still sober, good job. But he said this thing of, I found that it's better to weep with my wife than to get drunk alone. I found that it's better to weep with my wife than to get drunk alone, which really, it kind of brings it back to, Sam, what you were saying of, like, reach out and call a friend if you're in this place. Like, some of what the shutdown can be is you can be in this place of temptation to addiction, and then you shut down, versus really reaching out to have that kind of support.
Right.
And to maybe cry. It's so hard as men, am I right, Zach?
Yes.
To be honest about our sadness, to be honest about our despair. But oh, what a healing balm it is.
Yeah.
To find comfort in that place. And where we've been comforted by God, like it says in 2 Corinthians, where we've been comforted by Him, we can comfort others.
Right.
And so there's really this mutual sort of giving and receiving of comfort. Now, God is the comforter, capital C, but we learn to comfort each other in those moments of despair and depression. But it takes a lot of courage to do what you just said, Sam, and it's reach out and call a friend when you're feeling low.
Oh yeah. I agree. I think that was so good. I don't know what else to add to that. That was so good.
I also think about, like, there's been a time in my life where I didn't understand why I was sad. Or why, like, there wasn't a loss of a job. There wasn't a loss of a friend. There wasn't a moment of pinpointing. And for me, that was a signifier that I wanted to reach out for additional resources to help me discern what this, maybe was being produced in my life from. And so for me, that was a good indicator on a time that I was glad that I reached out for additional help. When it's maybe not as clear as day, here's the episode in the moment that has thrusted this forward. So that was helpful for me to feel permission to explore the sadness.
Oh yeah,
that's good.
So.
I agree. I think a lot of people are afraid to explore the sadness. Like, I know as guys, like you just said, one of the best ways they think that, we think that we're dealing with it is to either escape from it or stifle it and do something else, right? I guess that's more the same thing, but like that, you see a lot of guys dive into, you can say sports, you could say games, you name it. And guys are a little bit more keen to escape. and I was talking this with one of my guys, and I want to hear y'all's opinion on it. I know this is a little off script, but we were talking about gender responses to certain things, and so we were dealing with like heavy emotional toil, like we're talking about depression and hard sadness that we're dealing with. As a guy, I feel like sometimes our response is to escape, is to stifle it, is to kind of run from experiencing that kind of thing. Yeah. And, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that as a girl, it's sometimes more the case that you're willing to sit in it and not escape from it. Now, I could be wrong in that. Correct me if I am.
I wouldn't correct you, but I might expand it in that women often allow their emotions to become more true than anything else. I would venture to say the pendulum would swing. Instead of hiding from it, we hide in it, and it becomes the fullness of our truth. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I tend to hide more in things and escape, I guess, through music and stuff like that. Like other girls, they'll hide it and kind of stifle it with doing their makeup or getting their hair done constantly. Hide it appearance wise to not make it look like they're sad or depressed.
Yeah, and I think there may be some gender specific tendencies, but it really does depend on the individual. Some of it, so for me as a marriage and family therapist, one of the things I'm always thinking about is how does the family of origin for the individual really impact how they're dealing with things.
Yes.
So how were emotions handled in your family?
Yes.
How was conflict handled in your family? When there was the loss of a pet, how was it dealt with? And so I think some of this is about what is also kind of theologically, what's our view of pain and suffering in this world? What do we do with it? I mean, nobody wants to feel pain.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to suffer. No one wants a car wreck or cancer or some calamity to happen. But we live in a broken world. So we have to, as believers, think through what's my response going to be to these different things that are happening in our lives. And so the depression, the shutdown place can really be this emptiness and this black hole, like it's trying to nip at your heels, and even where we can almost accuse God. Well, why did we? You hear why did this happen to me? And these kinds of questions that we ask. And I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think God can handle them. When I read the Psalms, I think God can handle these honest questions. And so sometimes I think that shutdown place comes from we're just internalizing everything. We're stuffing it. We're ignoring everything down in there. Dr. Bradshaw would always talk about in some of our classes in school, he was famous for saying this, where pain is inevitable in this life, but misery is optional. Pain is inevitable, but misery is optional. So it's like you take someone that loses their job, and that's painful, and then they develop an alcohol addiction or a porn addiction on top of that, and they just turn their pain into misery, which really can kind of be like that graveyard spin down and down into more despair, which then that depression can really almost take you by the ankles, and you're in that shutdown mode. And so back to some of the practical things. I mean, I think Samm, the reaching out and calling a friend, the isolation that can happen when you're depressed is such a big deal. And with COVID, I mean, right, we've already talked about this, but the need for each other hasn't been more great right now.
Right.
And you can't connect through Facebook or Twitter or Instagram like you can around a fire face to face.
Exactly.
And so I think obviously social support is going to be super helpful. I think that if you think what's happening in the body with the shutdown, it's like, how can you get yourself up and moving? Yeah. Sometimes just being able to get up and just force yourself to make your bed can be like the domino that helps you get going a little bit.
Yeah.
Exercise is a huge part of this wellness recovery with depression, where you're getting sun, you're getting some cardio. I've got to make sure, especially this time of year, that when the time changes, making room in my day to get out and get sun, because I'll come home and it'll be dark.
Yes.
And I've not been outside all day long.
Right.
Yeah.
And so paying attention to some of these things really is going to help people, I think, get back. It helps me. What have you guys found? I mean, I'll not to be the question asked.
No, you go ahead.
What have you guys found that works? Like when you do find yourself in that despairing, depressed place, like what's working for you guys?
The outdoors often
Yeah,
is,
outdoors.
man, that fresh air, the breeze blowing, like, and I think getting out, it's a choice. It's kind of like just make one next choice, one right next choice of like, okay, I'm going to do just one thing. I think it can be debilitating to think about like trying to get to the end of the mile. So I look down at my feet and just take the one next step.
I like that.
And so allowing myself to think about what's just the one little step, and maybe it's making my bed like you said, you know, maybe it's opening the door and walking outside just for a short little bit of time. But just instead of getting daunted by the mile, looking at the next step.
I like that.
Yeah.
For me personally, it's setting a schedule. Like Sam and I were talking about this the other day.
Yeah.
Like I felt like I was like losing touch with reality just a little bit, and she was like, well, what's one thing that helps you keep in touch with reality? And I was like, well, creating a schedule, like a simple schedule that I can stick to, and pushing myself to do, like, I do one thing, great, that's awesome, I feel great, what's the next thing I can do?
I like that.
Yeah. I think for myself, I love music, and so firstly, you know, getting something done is always super helpful for me. Just it can be this dumbest, simplest task, but doing something that like, even if it provides no productivity to my day, but like finishing something is good for my mental state. And then like, I love singing in the shower, and I know that may seem silly, but like,
I like that, Zach.
I feel very.
I dance around my room.
I feel very renewed when I get to like have a minute to sing as loud as I can, top of my lungs, alone in my shower. You know.
That's awesome.
So I know we kind of talked about basically everything we need to talk about. So my last couple things are going to come down to, you know, we talked about community. Now, in this area of community, what happens when we see somebody else that's dealing with this? Like, how do we've talked about how we reach out, but how are we supposed to deal in a position where we are trying to get somebody else to reach out, or we're trying to reach them? Like, how do we do that in the most, I guess, in the most loving way, and the most, I don't know, not useful, but like maybe practical or helpful way, I guess is what I'm going for.
One of the things I think about is a person's love language, and like trying to reach out to them in the way that they're going to receive love. And so like if they're not a words person and I just keep throwing words at them and just texting them nonstop, oh my gosh. If they are, you know, if they don't, like if you do stuff for me, it makes me feel the opposite of what you intend. I don't like people to do stuff for me. And so when you are like, you come over to my house and you cook me dinner, I feel worse. You know, and so knowing a person and the way in which they receive love and affirmation could be a really helpful pit stop to make in thinking about how can I help them. Think about not how maybe you want to be helped, but how they want to be helped can be a good thing. You were getting ready to say something, Kate. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I don't really know.
It's okay, man.
Well, and I think with the people that you're the closest to, I like what you're saying about love languages. It makes me think of just being a good student of your significant other, if you're married, or being a good student with friends, of sort of being curious about what they might need, and even helping them externally process about what they might need. If they're going through a really hard time, say it is a breakup or a loss of a family member, or just grieving the holidays being different or weird. I think the staying connected part, even just the smallest gestures, like a text or like a funny picture, a funny video, I think that we just were made for connection. And so checking up on people, you know, I had a friend today that I hadn't talked to in probably, I don't know, 10 days or so, and we're good buddies, and he was like, hey, Jarrod, just thinking about you, is there any way to pray for you? and he didn't know like this podcast was happening, and I was like, please pray for me. I've got to talk about anxiety and depression, and it just felt such like an act of love that made me kind of open up in my heart.
Yeah.
That, okay, like I'm not alone in this. But I do think to touch on with suicide and suicidal thoughts, this is something that I talk about a lot in my office, and it's not something that we should be ashamed of if we're having dark thoughts. And some of the research will really show that when you're talking about these kinds of dark thoughts or suicidal thoughts with trusted friends that are safe, that are trustworthy, that it's actually helpful. And so I really encourage, if anybody's out there dealing with suicidal thoughts, especially this time of year, to kind of put that on the radar for people.
Yes.
And so there's a difference between I'm having a dark thought and I'm actually contemplating doing it.
Having a plan.
Yeah, one thing is if you're really contemplating it, if it goes beyond just I'm having a kind of a bird that comes along and is planting that thought in my head kind of a thing. If it goes beyond that to more of an intention or a contemplation, that's where I would say it's really going to be important to reach out to someone.
Yes.
Especially a friend first that you really, really trust, but then you might really think about a trusted mental health professional to talk about how can you be safe through some of these dark winter days. Suicide rates are skyrocketing through this time. And so we should be near to one another this time of year. We should be okay. I'm using the word should, but in a very like important way, like in a significant way. We can't do this alone. And so there's different resources out there. One I like a lot, you could Google like a wellness recovery action plan. So like if you get into some dangerous places in your thoughts and in your emotions, you can work alongside a trusted counselor through a wellness recovery action plan that helps get you to sort of a daily maintenance of things.
Yeah.
To give you a couple examples with that, you may need to think through what are the triggers that are making me feel so down and depressed. What are the things that are making me feel so sad? And there could be some seasonal parts to it too. What are the early warning signs? What are the things that I'm noticing in my own body responses? Am I sleeping a lot more? Am I just not excited about anything? And knowing what to do if there's a crisis. Who are the people you can call on speed dial if you're in a really low place? Because again, pain is inevitable, but misery is optional.
Right.
Turning this gloomy time into something even worse is not what's going to be helpful for your long-term wellness.
Yeah.
As an addendum, could I ask you to give further clarity on when a friend reports to them that they're talking through intentions and contemplating it further? When would you encourage that friend who's hearing this information to go to other resources?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so again, the difference between having thoughts occasionally about hitting the easy button, that's how I say it. Like, man, it would just be better if I wasn't here. Like, where that's like a fleeting thought, and it's kind of a bird that's like, around your head, but you're not letting it nest in your hair. Like, that's something that you just, hey, can you pray for me?
Yes.
Like, I'm having kind of these suicidal thoughts here and there. I have no intention. I have no plan. I have no note. I'm not. It's every once in a while. It's once a week. It's once a month. Something like that. That's where, hey, reach out to a trusted friend. Reach out to a pastor. Reach out to people that you really trust with it.
Right.
If it goes beyond that, where it goes to like I'm having these suicidal thoughts multiple times a day or multiple times an hour, and it's moving into I'm really starting to contemplate ways that I might even play this out, that's where let's keep everybody safe.
Yep.
And so it's not like a threat thing to need to reach out for help. It's like, oh no, it's actually a good thing. During this time, let's keep each other safe. Let's pay attention to where it does kind of switch over into more of a plan or an intent. That's a more active suicidal ideation that I've had clients that we've had to work it through where they've had multiple suicidal thoughts a day, or sometimes even in extreme cases multiple suicidal thoughts an hour. So we start thinking through, okay, well, let's talk about those thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why are you going to those thoughts? And so then it's a safe place to, it almost takes off the edge and the taboo.
Yes.
And people start to, in most cases, not every case, start to get better because they feel safe to talk about these shameful things.
Right.
And they start to make a wellness recovery action plan where there's daily maintenance of exercise. There may need to be some med management through this time. There may need to be some consideration of diet and social support.
Right.
And what is going on sort of in your mental and emotional health in general.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not a shameful thing to reach out for help during these, especially if it gets to more extreme places like I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's good. I love that. I love that we're talking about like as dark as we can go, because I feel like this is something that some people just don't want to talk about. They just want to avoid.
Yeah.
And as believers, we believe that Christ has redeemed us holistically from our toes to the way that we feel about things, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, we have to talk about how he has redeemed us and how we respond in him to all these different things.
Right.
Gosh, I'm so thankful that you guys have so much wisdom to pour out on an episode like this. Jarrod, thank you again for having us in Haven in your office.
I'm so glad
And,
to be able to be a part of this.
yeah, so we're so appreciative, and we're so happy that this worked out. So thank you guys for listening. Please don't be afraid to like, comment, hang out for a while, and we'll see you next time.
Bada bing, bada boom.
There it is.
Good job, guys.
I hope we keep that bada bing and bada boom. Just a little end. See if they stick around for it.